Thank you, Nicole, and thank you for taking the time this afternoon to join the Alliance to talk about what I think is an incredibly important discussion. I think it's one of those things where, so much research, so much information, there is really so much knowledge in our industry that too few people know and understand. So to be able to have this discussion, learn from each other, take a few tricks. I mean, my hope certainly is that out of all the things I do want to cover in the next half hour or so, you can take, even if you can take just one or two nuggets away with you, hopefully it can help in, your efforts to really improve that communication level and hopefully advance the knowledge that everybody else out there has. So I am crossing two screens here. So if I'm not looking straight at, just bear with me. I'm going to share my screen here. And then that way I can show you a few pictures. There we go. All right. So as Nicole mentioned, I am going to do my very best to keep an eye on the chat box on this screen over here. So, of course, at this point, it's not going to show up, but that's all right. Maybe, Nicole, you can keep an eye on it for me. And then if there are questions, just flag me down, because now that I'm in presenter mode, it's disappeared and I'm not going to try to fix it now. So basically what I want to do is I want to go over, Nicole kind of gave a bit of a highlight in terms of what it is I want to do. I want to kind of cross over in terms of some of the work that I've done. I know that our audiences may be a little different, but I'm an enormous believer that the strategies and some of the things that we do are just as effective for you, provided you think about the audience and do things like that. I also want to kind of go over, how do people see research? How do people see science? How can you kind of improve, your own personal brand in some of that? And then how can we do a better job collectively to try to improve that knowledge? And then, if you have questions, enter in the chat box, and then, we can certainly open that up for discussion as we go along. I know Nicole said too much about me already, but just to kind of give an overview in terms of where I'm coming at this from. For us, we obviously milk cows, we grow grain. That's the job that takes the most hours out of my week. But before I came back to the farm, I actually went through for journalism, spent some time in the journalism world before I came back to the farm. And then since then, my wife and I, and, with other teams, across Ontario, we've worked on various projects, all really with an idea of sharing knowledge, trying to improve, people's understanding of, particularly for us, what agriculture is, what it does to, the rural economy, what it does to provide food, all that kind of stuff. But overarching in all of that, and this is going to be a theme I talk a little bit about, the overarching theme is that really what we try to do is tell stories. And this is one of those, I think, challenging things is how do we move beyond just thinking we're sharing information or we're teaching people things, and move beyond that and try to think of it as sharing stories. Because there's been a pile of research done, and, we've certainly seen it in the agriculture to consumer space, is if you ask somebody, would you like to learn more about agriculture? Most people say, no, I don't want to be educated. I don't want to learn things. But if you ask them, well, would you like to hear more about it? Then all of a sudden they say, oh, actually, yeah, I'd like to hear more about it. So we almost have to trick people into learning some of these things. And I think a big part of that comes from thinking of these more as stories and how can we share that information. So across the bottom are just, some of the projects that we've worked on over the last number of years, frankly, with varying levels of success. One of my first ones was the Dinner Starts Here blog. That worked well for about 18 months, but it was a lesson in, you have to be prepared for the fact that producing content and creating some of these things really can, burdensome maybe isn't the right word, but it really is an engine that needs to be continually fueled. It's hard to say create a blog, make 2 posts, and then never do anything with it again. Because then it just kind of falls off, and nobody will pay attention to it. That was kind of one of those lessons in that. We've been involved in a number of podcasts. The one that we did, it's one of those things of recognizing that creating this and doing communication requires resources. And I'm not necessarily talking about a lot of financial resources. We're pretty fortunate in today's day and age that so many of these communication tools are free, but never underestimate the time commitment and the fact that that is a resource to you as well. And it's not to scare anybody in it, but recognize that your time has value too. And you just have to budget that in when you are doing so many of these communication tools. And then we've had other ones that, our recent Cow Palace YouTube series, the Farm 365 hashtag from a few years ago. We retransformed Dinner Starts Here into a video series. Those are ones that if you plan some of these out, actually can see levels of success that start to reach the audiences you want. So it just requires a bit of planning. And that's really what I want to talk about today. Now, in my world, in a lot of the stories that I do talk about, one of the key audiences, one of the key demographics for me is the consumer. And maybe that's, partly some of the, folks that you're trying to reach. Maybe you're trying to reach more on the industry side. But I think, they share something, that's very similar. And that is the reality that they are absolutely inundated with information nowadays. If you think about all the information that has been thrown at you in the last 24 hours, let alone the last week or the last month, based on, what websites you visited, what television commercials you saw, what ads that were in shows or movies, the tweets, the Facebook posts, all of those, you constantly are seeing that. And the people we're trying to reach are constantly seeing that as well. For what I consider, to be the consumer, it means that it leaves them very confused sometimes in terms of what to believe. Because just the reality is that sometimes they hear the one, when it comes to food, is that I always like to prefer to think of the study that says red wine is good for you to drink, because frankly I enjoy to drink red wine once in a while. But of course, if I didn't like it, I could easily find studies that say no, that alcohol consumption is bad. And it's just that balance that we're always constantly seeing. And that may be in the food space, but recognize that even in the space that you're in and the information that you're sharing, recognize that there's already probably going to be preconceived notions about it. There's already going to be ideas of, does this work? Does it not work? It just is based on where everybody is coming at it from. So one of the key things that I always think about is you can't come storming in, waving a flag that says, I have the right answer, ignore everything else, because guess what? That's what they hear all the time, day after day. We have to think about, again, how can we share this information to help support them in whatever they're trying to achieve. Now, for us, one of the things we try to do a lot is to change the perception of what a farmer is and who a farmer is. I always show this in a pile of presentations. And the question I always ask the audience in this is, how many farmers sitting in an audience harvested all of their produce using wicker basket? And guess how many I have come across so far in my speaking workshop career? A total of 0, because this just isn't what agriculture is. This isn't necessarily what farming is. It's what a lot of people believe it to be, but it's not necessarily what it actually is. Sure, of course, we as farmers, we're always smiling. It's always sunny. We always have good days. That is, of course, factual. But how do we change it into something that, is different in terms of, the capital expenditure, in terms of the technology, in terms of what it is you're doing on a daily basis as a farmer? This is speaking to farmers directly. What is it that you're doing on a regular basis, and how can we improve that brand so that when you do share a story with a consumer, they already have a better understanding of what you've done to achieve that? What I want to do now is I actually want to throw a little bit of a quiz, and I'm going to give you each, I want you to open your chat box. If you're in the Zoom, it'll be across the bottom. Oh, in fact, I told you, Nicole, I couldn't find it. I just found it. So it'll be the box that says chat. I want you to get ready, get your keyboard ready, because I would like you to say if somebody asked you, what does a scientist or what does a researcher look like? What are those preconceived notions? What do you think people automatically think of in terms of what a researcher? Lab coat was the first one. Lab coat, glasses and lab coat, white lab coat. So, wow, isn't it funny how scientists, test tubes in a lab, test tubes, keep going. I want to see, pocket protector. Oh, good idea. Glasses. Yeah, that's funny. How about this guy? I actually, every time I look at this picture, I cannot stop laughing, because all I did was I Googled scientist, hit images, and this is the first image that comes up. And so far, it actually fits absolutely everything. Well, I guess he doesn't have a pocket protector, but it pretty much fits every description you've just given me in terms of who a scientist is. And in case you don't call yourself a scientist, you prefer to think of yourself as researcher, well, it's not a whole lot different. Microscope, white lab coat, very clean, very, perfect environment you're in. Now, raise your hand if this is you or this is you every single day. I don't see a lot of hands. You can do that in the, it's one of the buttons that is annotate. No, one of them has an icon. Well, we'll forget that. I'm guessing, how many does this say yes in the chat box if this looks more like what your day is? Or if this looks more like what your day is? I mean, she's not even wearing a white lab coat. Is she even researching? Like, compared to what a lot of people would think, this, I think, is more relatable to what you're actually doing. Yes, perfect. I think there's a lot of things that if we start the story of how you can be more effective and more engaging, I think one of the really interesting stories that I've seen from the research community is what it takes to get your information in the first place. I think the story of how you're doing that research, of the lengths you're going to. I mean, this looks like it would be awful on my back. I don't know if it's the same for you, but to just talk about that effort that goes into it, I think can go a long way. Because as we're going to talk in a little bit here, is there's a lot that goes into just simply being relatable and simply trying to push the idea that what the information you're doing does have relevance to the audience you're trying to reach. That's one of these really critical components to it. Because one of the realities, and I never liked to believe this early on, but I believe it more and more every year I do things. And I think it's a real challenge for particularly you in the research community, is the fact that perception always will outweigh what the evidence actually says. And I say that from the perspective of, one of the key examples, Nicole mentioned off the bat, we milk cows. If research comes out that says milk is good for you to consume, or research funded by the Dairy Farmers of Canada, how many people out there, no matter what the research is, no matter how it's done, how legitimate it is, there's people out there that are going to come back and say, oh, well, of course it does. DFC sponsored that. When in reality, and you can tell me if I'm wrong in the chat box, but I think one of the really key factors is having the industry fund some of this research. I think it's one of those things that it would be great if government funded everything all the time for whatever information we had, but that's not the way it works anymore. It's a case of we need industry there to say this is a priority for us. I know in the industries that we're in on grain and on dairy, the boards and the organizations, I think one of the really important jobs they do is set aside research dollars to say this is important for the industry. I don't think that takes away from what you're doing as a researcher, or it's not going to provide any bias for you as a researcher. It's just how we can actually get the research done. But I point this out because I think it's really important for you to have the idea that just because the research says this is the fact doesn't necessarily mean everybody is going to believe it. There's almost a marketing element to it to go into saying why this is actually correct and how it can go. For me, one of the things that I preach a lot about is the idea that for agriculture to a consuming public, we have to understand that if we don't share our side of the story simply doesn't exist to a consumer. I think this line actually can be just as effective to you, and I use the word farmer for those that are researching and trying to share some of that knowledge with the industry itself, but you can trade that in for anybody you're dealing with. And one of the realities I think that we have to understand is that it's great for you to do the research, but frankly, in today's environment, if you don't talk about it, if you don't go through the effort of how do you share it, and nobody hears about it, then it didn't happen. It doesn't exist to people outside of the research community itself. So how can you kind of think through that to say, okay, if I want people to understand, then it's one of those things that step one is I have to be prepared to talk about it. I have to be able to be prepared to share about it. And I think that's one of the key components. So one of the things that I think you can start from is the idea of, what do you and I have in common? And I see, there's a couple hundred participants on the line. I'd be curious. I mean, I can't see you, but I'll pretend that several of you, if I said, how many people have children or grandchildren? You can raise your hand. Well, there's already something that I think we have in common that we can talk about in terms of, kids, grandkids, nieces, nephews. The dirty, wet dog in the middle is our dog Lila, who is, I hope you don't hear her snoring beside me, but that's what she's doing right now. We have pets that we care about. We have animals around us that we care about. We have an environment that we probably enjoy living in. There's a lot of things that we actually share in common, what we refer to as shared values. So one of the things that I think is important to do is start from a place of figuring out, if you're trying to reach someone, what's important to them? How can you start a conversation, not necessarily from, here's what I think is important and what I think you need to know, but starting from a standpoint of, what are you interested in? What would you like to learn? What's important to you? And can I share my story in a way that actually resonates a little faster with you? If I think about, particularly from the research side, from me and my business is a standpoint of, looking at, how does it impact my business is going to be one way that impacts. Is there a better return in it for me or for my farm by doing something or changing something? I see you've come off mute, Nicole. Would you like me to pause for a second?
Yeah, we have Clara Tucker with her hand up, Andrew. So I
Oh,
just want to
perfect.
pause for a moment and let her get her question in here. Clara, can you
Awesome.
hear us?
Or was that from she found the hand signal before I did when I said to
Oh,
raise your hand?
maybe it was a legacy hand.
Oh, because I found it. It's on mine. It says more raise hand. So we'll use that next time and then we'll get rid of everybody's hand. Maybe that's
Sounds
too
good.
complicated.
Sounds good.
So, but I point this out because, for me, when I'm looking at research, one of the key components, it's great. And maybe it should be if you tell me that, this would be great for the community, it would be great for the environment, it would be great too. Those are all important things. But one of the most important things to me, particularly on the dairy herd, comes around to, cow comfort, comes around to the economics of it, comes down to a lot of those business ideas. And probably in your research, there's that element that you can talk about. So how can you reach the audience by coming at it from what am I, the audience, more interested in? And I know it changes the dynamic a little bit, because when I look back and think, in here, and what do we have in shared values, I think we can use it still on the business front in terms of what are our shared goals when it comes to improving, the businesses of the industry, or whatever the research you're in is involved with. The other thing I think we have to get rid of is the idea that there is one type of audience. If you're doing research and you're trying to reach a farmer, I think we have to get out of our heads to say, okay, well, this is what a farmer wants to hear about. Because in reality, we are not all the same. We all have different goals, values, objectives when it comes to running our businesses and organizations. And even if you're not involved in direct research for the agriculture industry, I think this still fits, because as consumers, it goes the same way. We all have things that are important. Sure, all of us, may rank the environment as something high, but, is it, where does it rank in terms of kind of those 1, 2, 3 priorities for us? What are our long-term goals? How does size and scale influence our decision making? I think those are really key things that then you can go out and share information from. I think we have to get away from the idea that if I share this one story, it will reach every farmer and they will react to it. That won't ever happen, because we're too far. The spectrum is getting too wide that it just doesn't happen that way anymore. So it's a case of how can you, relate the information you're sharing based on maybe a few different audiences. What does a young farmer think of that may be on a smaller scale versus a larger farmer that may be older? What's the difference in priorities? How can you shift your message? Obviously, you're not shifting the facts, but how can you shift your message and the important points that you want to get across based on who you're actually trying to reach? Because again, if you don't reach them in the first place, your research doesn't exist. I saw one of the quotes come in here: if you don't publish, you perish. And you know what? That is actually, goes along the exact same lines. I would push it a little further, though, that, I've never in my life read a research journal. And so if your audience is other researchers, I think to publish in a journal is a great idea. If your goal is to reach an audience outside of the research community, you've got to think bigger than that. And I'm actually going to go through a few ideas in just a couple of minutes, knowing that my time is winding down before we get to the Q&A. And I should state that now that I have found my chat box, by all means, if you do have questions, if you do have comments, if you don't agree with something, by all means, enter it in the chat box, because we can kind of have that discussion as we go along. One of the other things, and this goes kind of along those same lines of what do people want to hear, what do they want to see, what do they want to engage with. This is a picture I took probably like 5 years ago now, as part of the hashtag I had done Farm 365 5 years ago. I took a picture every day of something we were doing around our farm as a way to build awareness of what we were doing around the farm to the consuming public. So this was one of the pictures I took, and it was by far the most popular photo that I posted. A lot of people saw this. In fact, Canada AM, CTV Your Morning, whatever it is called now, they actually, from 8 minutes from the time I posted it, it was on their morning show. That's how fast information can travel. Usually it's bad information. Fortunately, in this case, it was good information that traveled that quickly in today's day and age. This is the one which broke my milk truck driver's heart, because he was sure this should be the best photo. But I show this photo because this is obviously, my milk truck driver, Chris, taking a sample out of the bulk tank that then he's going to put that lid on, and it's going to go to the lab to be tested for a number of things. Chris was devastated to find out that this photo beat his. And when I say beat, I mean crushed in terms of engagement. This was actually one of my lowest engaged photos. Even though for me as a farmer, this is probably the story that I actually want to share more, right? We're talking safety, we're talking quality, all those things that I think should be important to every consumer. But man, you can't get away from the feel good. And so I use this comparison really to talk about a couple of things. Is one, the idea that, again, we have to think about what is your audience, what is my audience interested in seeing, in hearing about, and how can we shift our messaging to that. But in the same breath, it doesn't mean that I think a photo like this is a failure. Because what I do believe is that when we share stories like this, and we share, things of that kind of feel good, this is how we can build an audience in some ways, then we can slide in some information. Maybe not as many people see this, but more people saw this photo than if I hadn't taken the time to build the audience, in the year leading up to this photo. So it's kind of that, counterbalance, is we can't talk only about this. And I also believe we can't talk only about this. How can we balance that, between what does the audience want to see and what do we want to share? How do we find that balance? I would love to say that I've got every single answer in terms of here's where that line is. That line is a moving target on a regular basis. You've just got to continue to kind of work at it, and you kind of find your way as you go along. The other quote that I do want to bring up quickly is one that I do think certainly we in ag are guilty of this. I hate being critical, but at the same time, I think the research community also faces this challenge, is believing that when we do something to communicate our information, that instantly that is good, we're done. We sent out a press release. Phew, we did our work. Well, in reality, maybe that isn't as far of a step as you need to take. Are there more things you can do to try to achieve that? I have started a list, and this is one of the things that I would love to hear more on the screen. Okay, I have a question from Cameron. So I'm going to pause this thought while I read this. Important is the appearance of research, communication, and engagement. What do we miss out on by not having professionally designed fact sheets, videos, infographics, etc.? Is good content good enough, or do we have to pay the money to package it as well? That's actually a great question, Cameron. And I would say it depends on where you're sharing that information. If you're trying to share it on a social platform, the Twitters, the Facebooks, all of that, then I think it has to be short, sweet, snappy, and pretty. I think it has to fit all those categories because we do it all the time. You know, watch yourself, think yourself of how you scroll through a feed. Do you stop at the text heavy ones, or do you stop at the right images, the right videos? You know, clearly Facebook is learning something, you know, because as I scroll, you know, I stop at those, you know, tractors stuck in mud and, you know, a truck flipped over because it, you know, got off to the side and did like terrible things to look at, but I can't help myself to be drawn to that. But then I tend to scroll over the things that, you know, when the read more comes up, I rarely look at it. And so I think there's an element of that. But again, you know, maybe there are other places that it doesn't have to be, you don't have to spend a lot of money or a lot of time making it pretty. So when I look at some of the ideas, these were a few things, and I would love to hear some suggestions, you know, that maybe you've tried. I know there's going to be lots more, you know, coming up after I wrap, but you know, some of the things that obviously social media, you know, is one of those tools that can reach audiences. It takes that middleman of a journal, of the media, of whatever. You as a researcher can post information and it can go directly to an audience. You know, and you can do that in a number of different ways. Now, that does go back to my, you know, last quote in terms of the illusion. You can't simply tweet it once and say, phew, I tweeted it, I'm done now, on to the next research project. Sometimes when it comes to this, you know, is there a way to do to build that over time? Can you share information about what your research is looking like as you progress? Maybe not sharing the conclusions, but talking about, you know, here's what we're doing today in an effort to find the results. You know, can you build an audience over time by sharing, you know, the process, not just the result? I still think that email blasts, you know, work well. Obviously, you have to have an email newsletter list that grows over time as well. But, you know, are there ways that, you know, monthly you can send kind of the updates that says, here's the latest information that we found, here's what we're doing, you know, results to come. Both of those in social media or the email blast, they take time to build those audiences. You know, I've been fortunate over the last number of years to be able to build the audience, you know, on the social media side through a number of different platforms. But in reality, you know, I've been at this for 10 years now. You know, and the numbers keep growing, but never assume that, you know, tomorrow it's going to be, as soon as you release that one research result, that the audience is going to blow up. That's not the way it's going to work. It's going to take time. It's going to take commitment over that long period of time. I do think that working with other organizations is one of the absolute most critical things to do. You know, based on your work you're doing, who is that impacting? You know, and maybe some of the funding has come from, you know, the industry to do that, but maybe it hasn't. What's stopping you from still reaching out to that organization to say, you know, Grain Farmers of Ontario, Dairy Farmers of Ontario, you know, Rural Municipality Association, whoever it is that your research is going to impact, how can you do that search to find out, okay, what associations, what organizations exist that I can share this with, and maybe have a quick conversation to say, I think this has real value to your members. I'd love it if I could give you a quick synopsis that you can pass through your email lists, or things like that. That can go a long way. Basically piggyback off somebody else's work that they've been doing to build their audience and build their communities, because they do exist. And I think that one of the things, there's hundreds of these associations and organizations that exist out there. Why not take advantage? Don't expect them to come to you. You can't do that. You'll have to do the work to reach out to them in the first place, but build that relationship that then hopefully you can use over and over and over again as you go about. Obviously, hopefully in today's world, we get back to in-person meetings, but obviously there's still lots of virtual meetings. And honestly, there's lots of organizations that would be happy if you called them and said, your annual meeting, could I have 15 minutes to present what I found, because I think it's important to your members because of these 3 reasons. I think you'd find a pretty receptive audience. There are a lot of meeting organizers that would be quite happy to shave off a few minutes of them trying to figure out what they're going to talk about. Particularly if you can bring, something that would bring advantage to their members. The other one that I think is important, this is me coming from a journalism background. I think it's one of those things that, magazines, newspapers, radio as well. We've done this, for a number of different organizations in the past, is the reality that, staffing resources in the media are incredibly low. They are in fact hungry for information. Is there a way that, again, you can't send necessarily the whole research paper to a newspaper to say, here's what I found, call me, and then you can write a story. Don't do that, because they're not going to do that. They don't have time. They don't have the resources. What if you wrote that newspaper story, though, as if you were the reporter? You would actually be shocked, I think, if you submitted it, how many might pick that up. Of course, you've got to do the work to say, okay, they've got maybe a limit of 400 words, 600 words, deadlines fall on these days, whatever it is. You have to work within their parameter. But in a lot of cases, they're quite happy to get that information, and generally will then print it word for word. As I say, we've done this lots of times. My background is actually radio, so we do it with a number of radio stations where, we send 20-second clips with the introduction and the end of the story, and send it to those that might be interested in agriculture information. And guess what? It gets published and printed, because it's one less story they have to do. So that's kind of another idea that maybe you haven't thought of that does actually work. Jean, you mentioned detailed charts and graphs don't work unless an academic audience, and I would absolutely totally agree with you. If you're going to put a chart or a graph in, it's got to have one line and 2 numbers on the side, and that's it, just to show that, look, up is good, is about all you can have as kind of the detail, and then the facts to go with it. I remember, and I tried to dig it up. I wish I could find it. I couldn't find it in my filing cabinet before today. But one of the things I really appreciated one time was just on kind of a card stock that came in a magazine one time. It was research related to dairy, and it had about 4 research projects on it. And it has, here are the top 3 impacts of each research project. And it was 1-sentence impact. And it was basically, we saved this much in electricity costs, resulting in this much savings, like period. It resulted in this much more production because the lights were brighter, whatever it is. That's the most detail, unfortunately, you can get into, but it also is about speaking to what your audience actually wants to talk about. Now, this is kind of the very last point that I will mention, and then we'll get firmly into the Q&A. Ooh, I'm a little over, Nicole, sorry. And it simply is the reality that the more public you become, the more you put yourself out there. I certainly don't want to scare anybody away, but recognize that not everybody is going to agree with you, no matter how good your facts are. And this goes back to our perception conversation, is there are people that are just going to believe that in this case, every single herbicide is bad. That's just what they believe, period. No matter what you say, no matter what you do. And they are very willing to go after you over it. You basically just want to be prepared for the fact that you are going to have those that oppose you, that don't believe in what you're doing. And I can spend another 3 hours talking about how to deal with them. I will only start from the perspective of recognize that they exist in the world, and come up with a plan for how are you going to deal with those folks when they do come up. But with that, I will quit talking. I will merely highlight the 3 things that I think are kind of those key things that I'd really like you to take away. Is recognizing you have to talk about it, recognizing that simply stating fact probably isn't good enough. You have to figure out how are they going to perceive these as being factual. And take a look at the fact that just because you state something once, or just because you tweet it or send out one press release, does not mean that knowledge transfer has happened. It does not mean that communication has happened. There's more to it than that. So with that, I will stop talking. And radio is an opportunity. OMAFRA has access to 2 minutes a day on the Farm News Show in the Southwest. It's actually a great on CFCOM. It's a great example of one of those things where how do you, what's locked in there? Because, that's a perfect example. And having worked for the same company that CFCO is under, I can attest to the fact that the staff levels are not huge. They're looking for 30 seconds, 60 seconds, 120 seconds to be filled so that it can be done, looked after, their audience can get information, and they can focus on, the next 5 minutes. So any other comments or questions? I don't know, Nicole, if you have any.
Yeah, I just want to encourage folks to put their questions into the Q&A, give you an opportunity to have a drink, Andrew. And we have about 5 minutes left for our Q&A. You've done an excellent job of taking them along the way, Andrew. I really appreciate it. I think we have one from Carolyn there.
I'm just looking at it now here. Yeah, you know what? I think easy to digest, might go further than a 2-page research article in the Milk Producer, for example. I think it's a great example. I'd also encourage that maybe there is room for that 2-page article in the Milk Producer, because that audience is very specific. Maybe they're more interested in it. But, what's stopping you from then to say, okay, maybe I'll put a 1-page article in the Progressive Dairyman, and then maybe I'll put a 1/2-page article in Ontario Dairy Farmer, and then another, it's one of those things that there are so many publications, and then pitch it to, develop relationships with. I see the Farmtario newspaper has a brand new editor as of today, Christy Nuds. Christy's fantastic. I bet you if you can get a hold of her email, don't just send her a press release, send the press release along with a couple of points at the top that says, here's why I think this is a really important story for you to share. Or, send the article, that you've already done and said, if this doesn't work, by all means, give me a call and we can chat something else out. It's just one of those realities that, well, I'll give you one more example when it comes to, some of this type of stuff is, I remember when I was at the farm desk, CCanX was where I worked, in the farm desk. If I was away for 5 days and came back, my email inbox was close to 1,000. I can't go through that when I get back to work. I basically assume somebody else has looked at it and delete most of it. And that's just the inundation of press releases, articles, statements, all this kind of stuff. So how can you do a better job of, standing out if it is the media you're talking about? And relationships is a big part of how to do that.
Andrew, I was just going to pick up on a little bit that you were talking about with a shared community approach. Do you think there's a space for researchers to also establish their own community and their own series of messages that might come, it would take, because what you've talked about today could be a little bit overwhelming, right? Their plates are full with research, grad students, and getting the work done. It could be a little bit overwhelming now to know that we've got to work on our writing in this way, and there's a multitude of audiences we're trying to reach, and not every farmer wants to hear the same thing, right? So is there an opportunity, you think, to have a community of researchers at a prescribed interval or pace doing that shared community work too, right?
Oh, I think that's an absolutely great idea, because I state all this, and maybe that's another disclaimer I should add, is that I know that all of this isn't for everybody. Like, I recognize that you probably became a researcher for the same reason my dad became a farmer. And it's because you like dealing with your thing and not talking to the entire world every day. Like, it's not what you're most comfortable with. And so I certainly don't want to scare you and say that you have to do this or else. But maybe it's a case of, as you say, Nicole, maybe it is a case of finding someone who it is their strength to write an article. And maybe it's your strength to do, to share something that's, a little more day to day, or take pictures as you progress that then you can share with someone else, or, to sit down with, someone at GFO or DFO or EFO or CFO or any of the organizations that exist, and sit down with them, monthly, and just have this Zoom call to say, here's some of the research that we're working on right now. If I have a conversation with you, would you enter little tidbits of it in your email newsletter that goes out to producers every week? That's another opportunity. I just think the thing to do is think about, okay, what are you doing now? And is there something you could tweak a little bit that maybe builds on that communication effort?